back to Bookish, and welcome back to the latest episode, or the next episode of Bookish After Dark. Today I want to talk about F. Scott Fitzgerald and his wife Zelda, and how two books pretty much finished off their marriage. So as a lot of people know, the love story between F. Scott Fitzgerald and Zelda is somewhat legendary. Legendary for the way in which the story played out. Fitzgerald, a young officer away from home in Alabama, falls in love with the beautiful Zelda Sayre, the daughter of a prominent Alabama judge, I believe, and woos her and attempts to get her to marry him as he's about to go off to war. He never goes off to war. He goes on to write an incredibly successful first novel called This Side of Paradise, and after that Zelda agrees to marry him. In part because Fitzgerald had more or less promised to put her in the novel if they could ever enter into a relationship. And there's no doubt that he went back and rewrote part of This Side of Paradise to include a more Zelda-like character. And from there, with success, they were off. Fitzgerald was this up-and-coming, promising young author whose book was selling thousands of copies. They were successful, they were young, they were both very attractive, and they participated and did a lot of things young people did, including drinking, and you probably maybe know stories about them dancing on top of taxi cabs, or jumping into fountains, or doing things that cost lots of money and destroying things. They played pranks on other people. They were kind of a wild couple, and they were in effect living that kind of jazz age lifestyle that we associate with Fitzgerald and his books. And that's probably, the truth of the matter is that the problems probably started right there. It's likely that F. Scott Fitzgerald was already well on his way towards alcoholism by the time that he and Zelda married, and that Zelda had problems of her own going back into her own background. Nevertheless, they got married, they had a kid, they moved all over the country from New York to Minnesota. Fitzgerald wrote a second book called The Beautiful and the Damned, which was largely autobiographical. And when that book was published, the couple were such celebrities that a New York newspaper asked Zelda to review Scott's novel. In the course of that review, Zelda more than implied that Scott had essentially plagiarized her ideas, that he had taken lines and ideas from some of her letters, and that one of her diaries was actually missing. And this led to this kind of idea that F. Scott Fitzgerald was just plagiarizing things from Zelda. Now, I think that's overstated, but you can find lots of people on, the internet and elsewhere who believe that that's true. But what I don't think is in dispute, if you're asking me, I don't think F. Scott Fitzgerald plagiarized Zelda's writing, because their writing styles were very different. But I don't think there's any doubt that F. Scott Fitzgerald his writing was influenced by Zelda. The famous line, one of the famous lines of The Great Gatsby, which was Fitzgerald's third novel, published in 1925. One of the famous lines from that is that Daisy essentially says, that she wanted her daughter to be a fool, essentially. And that line actually came from Zelda after the birth of their only child, a daughter who they named Scotty, or referred to as Scotty. That line actually came from Zelda. And if you know anything about Zelda, you can see Zelda in the character of Daisy Buchanan, who is in fact a Southern belle, married a wealthy, influential family, moved north. There are parallels to be drawn there. And this kind of leads to something that I do think is worth considering about Fitzgerald and Zelda and their relationship. He clearly seemed to be searching for inspiration from Zelda, and oftentimes it's things that Zelda does, or Zelda says, or Zelda's behavior that he fictionalizes and puts in his book. And there really isn't any doubt about that. In 1925, Fitzgerald had published his greatest novel, The Great Gatsby, even though at the time it was a commercial failure and it wasn't even all much of a critical success. But by this time, Fitzgerald and Zelda are living in France. They're in the south of France. They're with the Gerald Murphys and Ernest Hemingway, and they're hanging out in the sun with wealthy, influential young people and writers, and they're having a great time, and Scott is trying to write his next novel. Okay, it will take F. Scott Fitzgerald 9 years to produce what will be his fourth novel, Tender is the Night. And in that time period, beginning from the time in which they more or less ended up in the south of France, until, really the dissolution of their marriage, when Zelda is more or less permanently committed to psychiatric sanitariums. It's during that time period that everything for the Fitzgeralds falls apart. And this is where a lot of the mythology, I think, around their marriage is built up. And, Ernest Hemingway plays a role in that. And so we can kind of view, and lots of people, take sides in the Fitzgerald and Zelda marriage, who was more right and who was more wrong. And what I'll tell you is that, the opinion of lots of people, and Fitzgerald as well, is they just never should have gotten married. But there were things that were going on during that time period which were problematic and showed the signs of stress that exist in their marriage. Scott was drinking very heavily and trying to write. Zelda had attempted to get into ballet and have a career as a ballerina, and she took ballet lessons for 3 years from a Russian ballet instructor, hoping that she could do that because she's always loved dance and been interested in dance her whole life. But by the time she's doing that, she's well into her 20s and she's had a child, and anyway. So this dance career thing really kind of falls apart for Zelda. And a lot of the time when Scott was trying to write Tender is the Night, Zelda was bored and she didn't have anything to do. And so this is where we get the idea from Hemingway that Zelda intentionally distracted Scott from writing, that she couldn't have an artistic career, so she was going to ruin Scott's career on one level or another. I don't think that's fair at all, but I do think there's no doubt that Zelda, young, vivacious, lively, funny, I don't think there's any doubt that she was bored during the time that Scott was writing. And it's while they're living in the south of France with the Murphys that the Fitzgeralds meet a French aviator from World War I, whose name was Edouard Jossan. And Edouard Jossan will be a really important figure in the future of their marriage, and a figure in Fitzgerald's writing as well. So, depending on who you ask and what source you'll go to, Zelda either had an actual affair with Edouard Jossan, or it was just a flirtatious relationship that was never actually consummated. Or you could go with the idea that F. Scott Fitzgerald actually encouraged Zelda to have an affair or to enter into this flirtatious relationship with Edouard Jossan. There are all kinds of ways that you can look at it. And to be honest with you, the Fitzgeralds themselves don't really offer any clear answers about what goes on between them. But there's no doubt at some point Scott Fitzgerald believed that this affair had become physical, that it was a real love affair, and he essentially moves to end it. According to some sources, he essentially locked Zelda away in their house for a month to keep her away from Jossan. Jossan goes on, by the way, Edouard Jossan would say that the relationship was never an actual love affair. It's just, flirtatious and friendliness and stuff like that. But certainly Fitzgerald thought that wasn't the case. And more proof that Fitzgerald thought that there had been something actually between Zelda and Jossan was that Fitzgerald entered into a relationship with a young American movie starlet named Louise Moran. And in a letter that Fitzgerald wrote later to one of Zelda's doctors, he more or less admitted why he entered into that affair.
Her affair with Edouard Jossan in 1925, and mine with Lois Moran in 1927, which was sort of revenge, shook something out of us.
So now we have the Fitzgeralds, who've been this couple who is really passionately in love and lived their lives and spent money extravagantly and engaged in wild behavior. Now each, at least in the mind of the other, has cheated on the other. And now their relationship is in serious damage. And now Zelda is coming to grips with the fact that she's never going to be a ballerina. And now Scott is sinking deeper and deeper into alcoholism and finding it harder and harder to write and produce the book that he's working on. In 1930, Zelda had a breakdown and she was hospitalized. She was put in a sanitarium in Europe. I believe there's one in France and then one in Geneva. She came out of the sanitarium after treatment, and then the Fitzgeralds returned to the United States of America, where she again had a breakdown, and she was institutionalized for a while, I believe at the Phipps Sanitarium, which was associated with Johns Hopkins University, and then eventually with a sanitarium in Asheville, North Carolina. That would be the final place where she was sent, and where she would live out the rest of her life. While she was in the sanitarium, while she was undergoing psychiatric treatment, while she was a resident in a psychiatric hospital, Zelda wrote a book, and that book was titled Save Me the Waltz. And Save Me the Waltz was essentially an autobiographical novel about her life and her life with F. Scott Fitzgerald. And she wrote that book and she sent it to Fitzgerald and her editor. She'd written some short stories and things like that before. She sent it to Fitzgerald's editor, Max Perkins, who was at Scribner's. And she sent this novel that she'd written while she was in the sanitarium to Max Perkins at Scribner's and asked him to look at it and think about publishing it without telling F. Scott Fitzgerald. And when Scott found out that this had happened, he was incensed. He was incredibly angry. He then read Zelda's manuscript. And when he read it, he became even angrier. Because when he read it, he realized that there were at least two things in there which would be really humiliating. One, it was clear there were things that Zelda had included that made it clear that this was an autobiographical story, which made him look like a staggering alcoholic incapable of doing anything. And part of what made that clear is that one of Zelda's characters' name was Amory Blaine. Well, Amory Blaine was the name of the main character in This Side of Paradise, Fitzgerald's first novel, and a Bildungsroman, which is largely based on his time in college, and that would be embarrassing. But even then, more angering to Fitzgerald was that, according to him, she had more or less essentially plagiarized a large section of Tender as the Night, the novel that he'd been working on for 9 years.
As you may know, I have been working for 4 years on a novel. About 50,000 words exist, and this Zelda has heard. One whole section of her novel is an imitation of it, and its rhythm, materials, even statements and speeches. This mixture of fact and fiction is simply calculated to ruin both of us, or what is left of us, and I can't let it stand. Using a character I invented to put intimate facts in the hands of friends and enemies, my God, my books made her a legend, and her single intention in a somewhat thin portrait is to make me a non-entity.
So this is where a lot of people really judge Fitzgerald harshly for being so angry about Zelda writing something that was plagiarized from him when, there was a lot of evidence that suggests that he had been plagiarizing from her. Wasn't this fair? Now, there are a couple of things to keep in mind about this before I go on. Fitzgerald spent money like it was nothing, and this drives Fitzgerald to write short stories at an incredibly rapid pace, and this is why he produced, I think, something like 160 short stories during this time period. He was well paid for some of them, like the Saturday Evening Post, I think, paid him something like $1,500 to $1,800 per story. They should have not had any money problems. But because of their debts and because of their lifestyle, Fitzgerald had to write these stories all the time. And he was constantly writing stories, which was one of the reasons probably why it was hard for him to complete work on Tender as the Night. Zelda wrote stories and had them published during this time period. And there's no doubt, again, that some of the stories that Fitzgerald wrote were somewhat inspired by things that Zelda had done or inspired by Zelda, indirectly. So the people who view Scott as kind of the bad guy in this situation look at the way he reacted to Zelda trying to publish Save Me the Waltz as an example of his hypocrisy, that he was willing to borrow from Zelda but not willing to let her borrow from him. But he considered himself to be the primary breadwinner, and in fact, he had been writing these stories, probably at the expense of his novels, as a way to support both of them for quite a long period of time, while Zelda essentially didn't work. And, their relationship had always been one in which Zelda kind of might have joked about Scott plagiarizing from her, but she never actually minded it, and this then reversed that. So one of the things that F. Scott Fitzgerald did is he got Perkins to hold up on any decision about the novel until the novel could be revised. And then F. Scott Fitzgerald revised the novel, taking out the parts which he felt had been plagiarized from his novel and getting Zelda to change the name of that character from Amory Blaine so it wouldn't reflect directly on him. But then notice something important. Then the novel is published. And the the record of letters between Fitzgerald and Perkins indicate that that Fitzgerald was active in trying to get the book published and in marshaling the book through the process of publication, because Zelda was in a psychiatric hospital at the time, and he didn't actually try to stop the book from being published. He just tried to get the book changed. Now you can read that however you want to, but that's what happened. And then in 1934, Fitzgerald's own novel, Tender as the Night, is published. And Tender as the Night is, much as The Beautiful and the Damned was, Tender as the Night is largely autobiographical. The two main characters are Dick and Nicole Diver. Dick Diver, and yes, that's the actual character's name. Dick Diver is a psychiatrist, and Nicole was one of his patients, and they got married. And she descends further and further in madness. She has an affair with a French aviator character, and then Dick Diver falls in love with a young, I believe 17 or 18-year-old American movie star, and they run off together, and Dick Diver's descent into alcoholism continues, and it really is, in lots of ways, just a replication of Fitzgerald and Zelda's relationship. And as Fitzgerald indicated in that novel, by the time you finish reading that novel, if you read that as this is actually Zelda and Scott Fitzgerald and not these characters, then you know that Fitzgerald viewed their relationship essentially to be over, which it was. Zelda Fitzgerald was moved to a psychiatric hospital in Asheville, North Carolina, where she stayed for the rest of her life. Fitzgerald went to Hollywood and worked in the movie industry. He died of a heart attack or a cerebral hemorrhage, I believe, in 1940 at the age of 44. Zelda is going to die 8 years later when the psychiatric hospital she was living in caught fire. She died in that fire, around the age of 50, and the tragedy of their lives kind of came to an end. But in a large way, those two books, Save Me the Waltz and Tender as the Night, represent the final stage, the final acts of their romance, of their marriage, of their tragic love affair, in ways which neither really recovered from. Zelda's sanity was lost, and Fitzgerald's muse was gone. Anyway, there you go. I hope you enjoyed this Bookish After Dark. I look forward to your comments in the comment section below, and as always, thank you for watching.